Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's talk with artist Guo-Liang. This talk has been organized in conjunction with this exhibition, Everyday Practices, which showcases the SAM's collections, including Guo-Liang's peripheral rituals. And today's session aims to explore the artist's thought behind the work and the process of making them. And the session will last for about an hour, starting with Guo-Liang's sharing, followed by a short response by me and our conversation. And then afterward, we will open the floor to questions from the audience, so please feel free to prepare any questions you may have. Let me introduce the artist first. Guo-Liang is a visual artist, primarily working in painting and sometimes work within other mediums such as text, collage, and video as well. In his work, surfaces, whether painterly or otherwise, become spaces for performing gestures of affect and conjuring a haunting conversation with the ghost of abstraction. So gaps and overlaps, traces, and fragmentation feature predominantly in his creative process. He is interested in how these frames orient our sense of time, body, and memory. Now, without further ado, let's hear from the artist.
Thank you. Thank you, Haeju, and thank you, Sam, for inviting me to give this talk, and to everyone for joining us on the last day of the Art Week. I think everyone has a very busy time. So I thought what I'll do today is that I will use the opportunity of the exhibition as well as the work in the exhibition to start to unpack maybe some ideas that I've had over the years, talking to different people at different points of time about my practice. And so it's not going to be a kind of linear kind of narrative of how the work is developed. So I'll be jumping from one work to the other, and also other artworks that help me think about some of the ideas that I'm interested in. So I'm not the best of public speaker, so I've written down something. So I'm going to read for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then after that, we can have a more sort of casual kind of conversation. Okay. So today's kind of talk bit is titled Peripheral Rituals, which is the title of the work in the exhibition. Notes on edges, intent, and giving attention. If I were to provide a description of the work Peripheral Rituals, it would go something like this. Peripheral Rituals is a set of 3 paintings made on a translucent fabric that is used in most of my work. They measure 163 by 136 centimeters each, occupying approximately the space of my body. These are horizontal paintings, meaning they are painted while laid flat, occasionally tilted any which way to guide the flow of paint. Their composition are neither wholly by chance nor by design. Rather, they unfold via an accumulation of relational and often wayward painterly traces that seem at times instinctual, at times procedural, and at times carefully composed mistakes. To provide a description of any artwork, not necessarily what the work is about, is to give it a kind of boundary, a shape that we might hold in our mind and compare it with what we see before us. The space between what we can say and what is, I feel, is where we can learn from our experience of art. So what are some shapes we might encounter in these paintings? A blob, a splatter, a hole, a broken line, a soft wash stain, a gentle fade. A fade is not exactly a shape. It is perhaps more of a state of transition, from one color to the next, from light to dark, from front to back, from clarity to opacity. A fade blurs the edge of things, withholds from certainty and loosens the grip. In her essay on the topic of hesitation, poet Anne Carlson writes around the painting The Dog by Goya and ponders the idea of the edge, and I quote, "And I wonder, do animals worry about falling off the edge of things? Do they see edges at all? Do they see an edge as an edge? Is that what the dog in Goya's painting is gazing at or searching for as he stares upward onto a vast empty yellow void in the sky above him?" At that point, it struck me that Goya's vast empty yellow void has something pre-Socratic about it. The pre-Socrats were the philosophers of antiquity who sought to discover what single substance constitutes the world. Water, said one. Fire, said another. Air, said the third. But it was the Milesian thinker Anaximander who identified the essential and original substance as something he called the apeiron, which means the bounded and the boundless, the thing with no edges. Abstract paintings are often interested in what curator and art historian Patrick Flores calls the elusive edge. He suggests that the edge demonstrates precision and enables near contact, which I imagine as a kind of critical intimacy. He proposes that by being simultaneously boundary and threshold, the edge in abstract can help reshape art's relationships, including its histories and our reading of its forms. On numerous occasions, I've been asked about my approach towards colors. To be honest, I am never quite sure how to answer this, except that color is not an idea. Ideas have rarely helped me to paint. Despite popular belief, colors cannot be neatly broken down like the spectrum of a rainbow and be put back together in exactly the same way. For a painter, the color is above all material and elemental, like the specks of particles in Min Tian Song's Time Dust, which is also in the exhibition. Pigments are distilled from the world around us, only to be mixed, pulled, compressed, folded in, and stretched out in painting. Similar to apeiron, color is continuous, ever shifting in its many hues, tones, and intensities. It is a substance that coats everything we see and touch. It is a thing with no edge. In another life, I was a painter of flowers, or more accurately, I made paintings out of images of old flower paintings. During this time, I had a postcard of Goya's The Dog pinned to my studio wall. In these renditions, there are no vases, no baskets, no containers of any sorts to hold the flowers together. Instead, the flowers hold themselves. For me, the abstract grounds against which the floral arrangements floated were always more important than the flowers themselves. They bounded the painterly marks together, gave them shape, but they also set the marks free. I was trying to hold the space of abstraction within the figurative. I see that now, this desire for the bounded and the boundless in peripheral rituals. Some elements gravitate and cluster, while others give way. The stretcher frame, ever so visible beneath the transparent fabric, locks in the radial composition, but there's also a sense that the paintings themselves are slipping towards the edge, leaving the voids in the center. They are slipping away because my body was circling along the periphery over and over, trying to find a way into the space of painting. The edge was where we met. Perhaps this approach describes my relationship to painting well. I have only ever known painting as this thing I can observe on the outside, rather than say something innate. As a young artist from Singapore learning about art in London in the early 2000s and returning home to a contemporary art scene with a complicated history to painting, the ground on which I made art was never a given. Painting to me inevitably always already means learning to paint and thinking about the conditions that will allow me to do so in the first place. This distance, I think, makes me somewhat suspicious of what some might call an authentic painterly touch. Hesitant, ambivalent, reticent. These are some words that my artist friends and writers have used to describe my paintings. In some cases, these adjectives were meant to compliment, in others, less so. How else are artists to speak to our audience, to the complexity of times, but with strong feelings, strong words, strong expressions? The world around us demands this performance constantly. Surely there is no time or space for hesitation, is there? To hesitate is to befriend doubt, to withhold from immediate decision or action, and to hold yourself firmly on the brink of time. But this suspension can also be a form of thoughtfulness and care, a means of resisting when there is no clear answer or choice, so we might delay and defer closure for the times ahead. When it comes to describing painting or art making in general, I don't particularly like the word chance because it connotes a lack of intentionality. To me, the act of painting is all about making choices, or decidedly about when and where not to make them. While peripheral rituals might appear sparse, fleeting, and even spontaneous on first glance, they are, as paintings, full of intentions. In the winter of 2016, 6 months before I made Peripheral Rituals, I attended a dance workshop as the part of Taipei Biennial. Under the guidance of choreographer Christopher Wavlett, the workshop brought together a group of participants consisting of both trained and untrained dancers to study, practice, and eventually enact Yvonne Rainer's 1970 piece, Continuous Project Altered Daily. As part of the process, we returned to the published instructions by Rainer herself. In it, she lists a number of elements that would be used in the live performance of Continuous Project. They include rehearsal, run-through, working out, surprises, marking, teaching, and several types of what she calls behavior. The idea was to channel a particular bodily score through one of these elements at any one time so as to produce varying results. After spending 2 full weeks of working through the materials collectively, something unimaginable to an untrained dancer like myself happened. We were able to read and discern, to varying degrees of success, one another's body movements, and more importantly, their intent. A hesitant turning of the body, for example, might signal that one is working out how to overcome an unforeseen obstacle. A pause in the sequence might be an invitation for others to join in and learn a new variation on a predetermined material. So, if I were to make a list of questions arising from making and looking at peripheral rituals, it will go something like this. Where does the edge of our bodies begin and the edge of a painting end? If we were to take painterly traces as residuals of our bodies and thoughts, how might we discern their intent? Are the marks left by someone who is rehearsing, someone running through, working out, marking, teaching, or encountering a surprise. Peripheral rituals also marked the first time I worked in multiples and with space. Over the next few years, I developed a number of works along this trajectory where forms and formats of painting interplayed with environments. So here I'm going to show just a kind of a collection of images of a couple of works that I've done that thinks about paintings as objects in space. So this is 1 and 3 flat things. So there are 4 paintings that are resting on stands, and this was at an exhibition in ADM Gallery. Montage 1 and 2, they were sort of these 2 paintings that were leaning against the wall like a mirror or a door. This is Arrive, which is maybe the largest work that I've made so far at the National Gallery Singapore at the Padang Atrium. So we can come back to some of these works later on if anybody wants to ask some questions. And Soft Turnings, which was 5 sort of double-sided paintings sitting on low modular platforms. And A Folding Scene, which was commissioned by the Esplanade to be placed at the concourse. The most immediate thing that came out of working spatially and in multiples was that I could no longer control or contain space within the confines of my own body. This meant I had to work in fragments and perceive the final arrangement with what might be best described as a kind of wide attention. The artist and psychoanalyst 𝘗𝘂 Milner distinguishes this from narrow attention, which is a kind of perception that is automatic, focused, and serves its immediate interest and ignores the rest. Wide attention, on the other hand, seemed to occur when one wanted nothing, when there was no need to select one item to look at over another, so it became possible to look at the whole at once. Coincidentally, the ability to switch between 2 types of attention is how dancers are able to move freely without walking into one another. So I was told that they see from the edge of their vision. This can occur in some paintings too, but not all. Singaporean painter Ian Wu, for example, often speaks of the relationship between fragment and whole when describing his own painting process. His works display a kind of attention that moves schizophrenically between minute details and expansive strokes, making visible the kind of embodied space that is contingent but strangely consistent. The paintings and drawings of Amy Silman often begins with shapes and fragments of the body and go through a series of painterly mutations and transformations, akin to the process of animation. Multiple pieces are sometimes placed edge to edge, like frames in a time-based sequence, as if the artists want to go on painting forever, uncertain of its end. So this is the work of Ian and Amy. I've chosen to bring attention to these 2 artists here, not only because of how and what they attend to in their works, but also I have the good fortune of knowing and learning from them. Finding affinities, I think, can also be a way of widening our own attention. In the context of everyday practices, I have been wondering how the inclusion of a work by peripheral rituals, and more broadly, abstraction, can contribute to our thinking about routine, gestures, and the conditions of living. Among the many artworks that directly express social political narratives in this exhibition, what is the value of the abstract that seems to withdraw from telling us what to think? Over the years, I have encountered the paintings of Maria Taniguchi many times across various exhibitions. I find a different kind of affinity in their austere monochromatic surfaces, by now a recognizable signature. Built painstakingly over time by outlining each brick in pencil and washing it with black acrylic, the artist creates subtle tonal variations and shifts within a strict material and conceptual parameter. Looking at her work, I am always drawn to the intricacy and intimacy of the pencil lines that form the edge of each brick. They display a keen and mindful concentration akin to devotion, a narrow attention without wanting. To quote the artist, people look at this work and they see abstract pictures, but in reality, they serve very practical purpose. These paintings take time, help me regulate my own production, my thinking. They set the tone for the rest of my work. To regulate, to take time, to set the tone. These are some of the things the lines in these paintings do. They do not desire to speak as such, but they perform tempos, modulate intensities, and in their making, reveal to us the hidden frequencies of living and working unknowingly. In this way, we can perhaps see abstraction as a way of attending to our attentions without predetermining what we wish to get out of this wanting. In other words, it can give us the space to pause and hesitate. This attunement of temperament was something that guided me while I was working on another folding scene, a recent work installed in an old abandoned apartment in the former French concession in Shanghai. Using the repeated gestures of folding and unfolding fabric, I surfaced the fold lines and material grains by layering thin paint on the fabric surface. These were made into a series of 4-sided paintings, which were then hung in the space to play off the architectural features and textures. The softness and lightness of the fabric contrasted with the hard concrete and worn wooden surfaces, while the angular forms echoed the structural pillars and beams in the room. In the background, a piece of field recording by Chiang Mai artist Anon Nong Yao of his countryside hometown floated sonically in and out of the work. Together, they called for a kind of atmospheric attention. So here I have a little short clip that would give you a sense of the atmosphere and the sound of the work. Thank you.
Thank you, Guo-Liang, for these beautiful presentations. I was so impressed by the clarity of your thought and your languages, and I've read your text in advance, and I also wrote down some thoughts as a response. Yeah, a few days ago, I read a book, Over to You, a collection of letters between the critic 𝘗𝘁𝘁𝘁 and his son, who is painter, the 𝘕𝘁𝘁. They were talking about paintings. So maybe, perhaps that's why I felt compelled to write something, but I'm not so sure that will be like as soulful and beautiful as yours, but I try. Please, I hope you and the audience don't mind me reading my short text. I was glad you brought up the question about inclusion of abstract works in this exhibition, regarding how the inclusion of a work like yours, Peripheral Rituals, and more broadly abstraction can contribute to this exhibition. Indeed, many of the works introduced in this exhibition refer to clear anecdotes or historical events related to the personal or societal narratives and adversities that artists have encountered. I'm aware that the main narrative of this exhibition has been somewhat inclined toward aspects of challenge and endurance. For me, the inclusion of more abstract works or artworks that do not directly describe specific situations was a deliberate choice to reflect the complexity of everyday life and our multifaceted emotions within it. In this sense, the notion of everyday practices might encompass a wide range of life aspects, and this is something we could not omit, or at the very least, wanted to hint at. So the exhibition drew its inspiration from 𝘗𝘁𝘳𝘁𝘁's one-year performance, which is the very first work of the exhibition, in which the artist confined himself to a holding cell for an entire year. Together with my co-curator, 𝘗𝘁, we identified 3 key themes: everyday, repetition, and endurance, as threads to weave the overall narrative of the exhibition. However, one critical aspect of 𝘗's work that should not be overlooked is the notion of time and its passage. Audiences are often struck by the fact that the artist spent an extreme 1 year inside the cage. But I often wonder about his mental space, how he would have contemplated the passage of time and what his mind was looking at. This interplay between mental space and physicality likely informed our decision to include more abstract works, such as yours or Maria Taniguchi's. We chose to place Maria Taniguchi's work immediately after 𝘗's cage because her canvas, filled with repetitive black squares and lines, which can be considered as part of the indefinite composition that can be continued and added on, somehow liberates the confined space into one of infinite possibilities. I might also add Apichapong's video to this list, as it depicts an abstract state, a sleeping face, that we can only guess at from our mental space. How do we describe our subconsciousness, which surely exists as part of our daily life, but cannot be clearly seen? I guess this could be connected to the question of abstraction. This silence, this existence without speech, this absence of description intrigues me and opens up a realm of interpretive possibilities. An exhibition, for me, is above all a physical experience. So as curator, I try to simulate in my mind what kind of experience I can create. But there is no single direction or prescribed pathway. I plant trees and flowers like gardener, allowing people to choose their own routes. I often find myself unable or unwilling to answer questions about the recommended order for viewing the exhibition. In places with distinct seasons, flowers bloom at different times. The experience of viewing the works depends on many conditions, including the viewer's mind. Curators cannot fully design or direct such experiences, but can only offer intentionally chosen possibilities. I have been thinking about whether this could be connected to your experience of composing abstract painting. I enjoyed hearing about your experience in the workshop on Yvonne Reiner's works. There was a time when I also closely followed the works of postmodern choreographers like Trisha Brown, Simon Forti, and Yvonne Reiner, as well as more contemporary choreographers like Anne-Therese de Kersmacher. I appreciated their refined, minimalistic movements that gave me time to read the gestures. This became a mental exercise, stimulating my way of perceiving the scene unfolding in front of me. It inspired me to curate a series of exhibitions called Moving/Image, a 3-chapter show that I developed from 2016 to 2020, where I explored the idea of performance as a moving image, juxtaposing videos, performance, and installation together to suggest that they can all be a sequence of images developing in time and space. In the dance, I particularly like the moment of stillness of pose, when dancers are on stage but not moving, breathing and looking at the space. This tension before something happens is a moment of anticipation, and when the dancers finally start to move, there is a sense of release. I like how you explain that abstraction can give us space to pause and hesitate. This is very much the feeling I get when I watch a dance performance. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Haeju. It was so beautiful for me to hear your thoughts, because I think we've been having a little bit of dialogue, but it's the first time I hear sort of this text, and it's also very thoughtfully and beautifully written. And I particularly like the bit you talk about curating and composing painting, because I think that was the impression that I got with this exhibition, was that there was a kind of rough framework, but then as I move through the different spaces, the sections are not, there's no kind of titles for each section, but I can see that there are sort of very interesting connection. So in a way, sort of very relational way of curating that's very open as well. Yeah.
I heard you also curated shows. You curate shows. Maybe your experience of curating can be. That's why I also mentioned this. Yeah, the composing abstract painting, comparing to curating.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I for the longest time after I kind of graduated in the sort of 2000, I did more curatorial projects, and most people knew me as a curator. But then I was doing those painting flowers in my own time to kind of preserve my own sort of identity of an artist, and they didn't get shown until quite a long time later. And so I think curatorial practices has always interested me, and particularly how curators compose space with artworks. And so I think this is before my interest in looking at dance practices. So in a way, sort of, I should add that curatorial practices to some extent also makes me think about composition.
I got some questions before the audience can also join us to the conversation. So I think that the decision of not using the brush in painting might be on significant meaning as well. So the book I just read, the 𝘗𝘯𝘵𝘦𝘳𝘁 also mentioned the brush is an extension of the body without nerve. So then, in that way, without using the brush in the painting, might have brought you kind of challenges and changes, and maybe the freedom as well. So how this idea of not using brushes came about?
So I guess with the earlier works, with the flower paintings, obviously I used brush, and of course it was painted in a way that was very conscious that painting is always an act of making marks. And so when I decided that because I was doing it for so many years with the flower paintings, that I felt that I really needed to have this kind of change in my practice. And one of the things that I've always struggled with was this idea of the for painters, this idea of the masterful stroke. Whether you're looking at sort of abstract expressionist work or Asian ink painting, the stroke is like the signature, the power. And I felt like as an artist, even as a very young artist earlier on, I felt that that was not me, that was not my strength as an artist. So I always thought about ways in which I could think about painting or making, but like sidestep some of these expectations. So the paintings are, like I said, sort of done horizontally, and it's more, for me, more about relinquishing that control or intent of the brush and let like material kind of take over a little bit, and to have their own sort of, I guess, to some extent, their own agency of helping me decide how to compose or where things should go, or so I think that's sort of like my guiding principle, and I feel like it has been, like you said, on one hand sort of challenging, because then I think you have to find other ways to maybe create something that would read like a mark or an intended kind of decision. But on the other hand, it was also liberating. I was freed, in that sense. And I think that is always something that I try to think about with painting, is that, I think painting is something you do where you can't ignore what has gone before, because it's such a long history. And how do you use its history, expectation for the audience in a way that is generative and not like a burden or something that traps you? So I'm always finding that I try and find a way into a way of working, but within that I need to find ways that I can be free, so not relying on the intended brush mark. Was definitely like something that I chose very, with a lot of intention to escape certain expectation.
So the Peripheral Ritual is one of the first works of this series that you started not use the brush. And
that was sort of more like after I had the kind of second solo show where it was this. So like I said, my talk is not chronological, so I need to go. And so I think Peripheral Ritual came after this particular exhibition called Go Screen. This was the first showing of this series of work. Yeah. So that came after. So I had this show. So it came after. So I think with this show, it was interesting because I think like the sense of bodily movement was not as strong. They were sort of almost like monochromatic with a little bit of stains and marks, but there was a kind of stillness to the work. And from that show, I commissioned some essays to be written, and Kevin Chua, who is an art historian, wrote about them. And he picked up, even at that point, that the marks seemed to be either staying still, or they were almost like just moving out of the painting, which happens because I was trying to wash off a lot of stuff so the only trace of movement was something exiting the surface of the painting. So then I think I suddenly realized that, oh, actually the movement is very interesting. And then when I did peripheral rituals, they were kind of the largest, at that point, the largest painting I could do or have done. And so one of the funny things was that actually I couldn't reach to the middle of the painting. So if you look at the work in the show, in the painting, in the middle, it's kind of empty. And you see the stretcher bar the most clearly in the middle. So I kind of thought it was really interesting that that I was trying to get in, but I couldn't. And because I was trying to get in, the painting was coming into the space of my body. And actually so I guess that's where I use the word peripheral, because actually the edge was where I could make something happen, not the inside. So that's how the work kind of came about, I think.
Yeah. I wonder, do you put a lot of importance in like choosing the titles of the works? In this case, it's peripheral rituals, and it's a triptych. So triptychs sometimes are often used in the religious paintings as well. So thinking about the fact that it's a triptych and you are using the word ritual, I was wondering whether there is a meaning of using this title as ritual.
I guess with the triptych as a format in religious painting, you usually have the center, which is the focus, and then you have the side, right? The side panels. So I wasn't necessarily thinking about that in a way that I felt that I wanted there to be a sense that there could be more in the series. So actually it could have been 4 or 5, but I thought 3 was like the minimum for a grouping. And instead of having like a center with the side panels, for me it was more important to think of it as like a circular kind of movement that was repeated again and again and again. Yeah, so I think that's how I thought of. So the kind of sequence is more important than or the sequence and the possibility of multiples was more important, I think. Yeah.
So you're following this work, we saw more your paintings placed as objects in space, according your experience, expressions. So then recent works are more placed in the space, and rather than just merely placing on the wall. And thinking about your experience of the dance performance workshop as well. Yeah, and I was wondering if so by placing the works in the space, then it creates the multiple viewing direction for the viewers as well. And then it might incorporate the audience's movement into the painting.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, when you create your work, you also imagined the painter's own movement of making it could potentially meet the movements of the audience.
Yes.
Maybe the edge of encounter between the work or your own you and the audience.
Yeah, no, I think that was one of the joy that I have in moving the work from the wall into space, and to kind of, like you say, sort of in a way curate the work, in relation to a site. I think like how I see the paintings is that I don't see the painting as a autonomous kind of object. Like, of course there are things in the painting, but the painting for me is like a fragment of something larger. And so I think I've always been drawn to looking at things not straight on, but also looking at like negative space or the space in between two things. And so I think once I moved into a more spatial kind of practice that allowed me to do it, to think about that sort of space, the space between the works, and sort of like you say, imagine people walking around it. So I think I've always been drawn to thinking about things like energetically. So, actually one of the joy of installing a work is to think about how people move. In the case of the last project in Sifang Space, the work was also moving a little bit, because as people move, the wind kind of moves the kind of hanging pieces. Yeah.
Choreography.
Yeah, choreography. Yeah.
This will be my last question. So yeah, the works we present these exhibitions, it reminds that the bodily movements are involved in the process of creating the painting, but also the work itself evoke kind of the body. Yeah. So the structure of the canvas resembles a skeleton. And then the translucent canvases and layers of colors also suggest the skin. So then the works actually are surrounded by the other works like Melotti's 𝘗𝘯𝘁𝘀𝘀 performance documentation and 𝘕 Kugan's portrait drawing, and even the 𝘠𝘭𝘁𝘁𝘁's piece that collecting the fingerprints. So these are all like referencing the body. So it kind of forms in that section somehow the collective of bodies. So what are your thoughts on interpreting, for me, your work as a representation of skin? Because at times I've wondered and worried whether this might shift the focus of your works to somewhere else. So, but if indeed you aim to present the body, what aspects of body is trying to capture?
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that arrangement, because I think it was sort of, I feel it was very subtle in bringing out the bodily aspect of the work. Because I think in the other works, the representation of the body, like you said, is much more visible, right? And I think as an artist, I think I'm not interested in that, in representing any specific body, but I do see painting as a kind of body outside of myself. And it's also a kind of filter, right, that I can try and let in some kind of experience, but also project out some kind of experience I have on my, internally. So I think in that sense, I think the painting kind of will keep some kind of remainder or residue of these either thoughts or movement. And I think previously I said I like to think energetically. So I also like to think about the body as a system of like energy, how you maybe compose something in the body and think about how things flow from one point to the next. So so I think in terms of body, maybe not particularly wanting to represent, but how can we think of the body differently? Other metaphors of the body, I think, can be very interesting.
Yeah,
to think of.
but you mentioned the size of the canvas is the size of maybe.
It's like basically the size of when I.
Yeah.
This is how, this is sort of the limit. But of course, with the later work, they get even bigger, and then that's just it kind of moves into a different space. Yeah. But this was the one where I felt I was most aware of my body at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much. We have around 10 minutes left, so if among the audience have any questions, please raise your hand and we will hand you the microphone. Maybe.
Somebody wants to.
Yes, okay.
Oh.
I feel so honored to have Guo-Liang's mic. Thank you so much, Haeju and Guo-Liang. As you're speaking about the energistic and the body, I can't help but think about the perpendicularity of the process. So there is the periphery from which Guo-Liang painted, and then the way in which the painting is hung. So I wonder whether you could speak a little bit about proprioception, especially as related to the softening of the gaze that allows for choreographers and dancers to move with a heightened awareness in space. And I also have a question about the crispness of the folds. So insofar as delineation of an outside or a boundary, so here perhaps we draw a distinction between the peripheral, which is about the outer bounds and limits as we approach something that is bounded, and then the liminal, so the threshold. So one is in to out, the other is out to in, and how that affects the way in which the maybe two types of works that you've presented here today, how that impacts the way that you think about your practice.
Okay, so I'll try to answer the three questions. The first question I think is maybe the easier for me to understand. So I think it's really right that you point out there is this two planes, right? The kind of horizontal and the kind of vertical process. So I think sort of art historically there is the flatbed, right, which all the abstract expressionists talk about. And of course, when you talk about the verticality, it's more of a tableau, which is kind of more European way of thinking about painting. So part of what I like to do is also that I like to look at what people expect in terms of binary and like not think of A or B, but A and B, you know. So I think it was quite conscious that the work, on some level, you can think of it as process-based, right? Which is and very horizontal. But on the other hand, I just really love a good picture, and you can't make a picture without putting it up, right? So I think that the work kind of exists between that in some ways. So it's another movement, you know, not just walking around, but also horizontal and vertical. The softness of the gaze. Yeah, no, that was a really revelation for me, because actually I'm really like uncoordinated. So when I did the dancing workshop, I really struggled. And particularly when I think there will be a prompt where they go like, I mean, one of the things that you do is like, okay, like run. And the dancers would just run. They would never walk into each other. And of course, I'm just like, you know, as most Singaporeans do, very bad at MRT, trying to not knock into everybody else. I couldn't do it. So I asked the dancers, how do you like nod? And they were like, when you look, you don't look in front. You look at the side of your eyes. Then you will know there's a limit to your periphery. So yeah, so I think, and I think when I compose or when I paint, there is always I think the moment of blurriness, of softness, is so that when things are sharp, it's sharp. Do you know what I mean? So I think even though it's a very thin layer, there is still that sense of almost like your eyes being able to move from attention to not attention, you know, in different parts of the painting. The last question, I'm not sure if I understood it correctly, but I would just say that I think the folding became something interesting for me because I was thinking about how to have another edge, you know, that wasn't pools of paint. And so the folding became a technique when I could produce different lines, right? And again, this is me trying to not fall into certain categories too neatly, is that even though it's quite there is a kind of process of folding, unfolding, layering the paint to reveal like the form or the marks. There's also constantly, during the process, what I had to do is to constantly decide if one part of the painting should be darker than another part of the painting. And so there is also actually an illusionistic quality which people don't talk about with process-based art, is that they always think that it's, again, if it's process-based, it's authentic, it's exactly what the process reveals. But then I think I was drawn actually to the illusionistic quality of the process. And so part of it was always trying to figure out, and it's not consistent, it's not like, I don't always get it right, and part of the inconsistency also breaks the illusion, and that's the fun of it, I think. But I'm not sure if I answered your question, the last one. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guo-Liang, for giving us this talk. I have two questions. One is this peripheral ritual. Why do you use aeronautical material? Is there any particular reason? And the second question is, I have a lot of visitors asking whether is that a face on the one on the right.
Yeah, I think you can see what you want in the painting. That's all. I think sometimes it's quite nice because that's part of like allowing the paint to do what it wants. Sometimes people see a shape of a figure, and it's nice. I like it. Yeah, it's not within my consideration, but I happily invite different ways of seeing into the painting. The aeronautical fabric is the fabric that I use. So I use it because I was looking for a very light material that would kind of make the marks kind of be heightened when you look at certain details. So I found that this material picks it up really well. And I also like the sort of historical connection that painting have with aviation, in the sense that early airplanes are made of wood and canvas. So I think there is some very nice connection, and I think when I did the NGS project, I was consciously trying to actually go back to this connection and kind of creating these shapes that actually reminds you of something kind of flying. And I think maybe because I'm so interested in this quality of suspension, right? Something being held in space, whether it's the flowers being held in the background or the way I suspend a mark on the fabric, that I think the aeronautical fabric just had some of this association that make the reading of something being suspended, like, kind of works. So that was how I came to use it. And it's very versatile. So I was also able to use the same material in so many different ways. Yeah.
Guo-Liang, walk us through your painting when you're in your studio. You mentioned that if not chance, if you don't believe in chance, if you are not for the intentionality of the master stroke, what then is your, what are the set of decisions you then have to make in your studio when you're painting?
So I think another word that's like very closely associated with chance is intuition, right? So a lot of people talk about, especially with these sort of painting, the word that we use a lot of times is instinctive. Like, how do you decide? It's instincts. So for me, that's very interesting, that in a way that I feel actually being instinctive is less interesting than being instinctual. That means that part of it is like having instinct, but sometimes instinct forms habits, then you repeat, right? then you also have to actively break the habit to form new instincts. So I think that's something that guides the work, of course, over a period of time. So one of the things that building instinct is that you can't happen in a day. You know, it's like over time, then you have those instincts, and the instincts are not rules, so you need to allow it to change. Yeah, and part of how I think about it, why I decide to do something or not do something, I think has something to do with how I sometimes try and form some kind of habit and then try to like break it so that the work, because I don't know, but I think for me as an artist, the most important thing is that the work moves. And so it can only move if you start to form certain kind of methodology and then like question it and then move on. Do you know what I mean? So I think that for me has been the guiding principle of making. Yeah.
Hey, Guo-Liang, can you share more about this shift in energy over the years from very small surfaces to the bigger works?
Yeah. I feel like that's like I don't know, I don't like to use like autobiography, but I think it's like, you know, if I were to look back when I first made art in my early 20s, I was a very different person and a very different artist. And so I think, you know, the flower paintings, you know, people have a very difficult time trying to understand what I did, but it really was a period where I felt a little bit displaced and also trying to create like whatever small space I have. And I think sometimes as a young artist, yeah, you can't immediately jump and do something very ambitious. And so you have to carve out a very small space that you feel like you are trying to articulate who you are or where you are at that point of time. And I think, and also I was sort of like making art not full-time, so there was a limited energy that I can give to the work, right? So things became very contained. So I think it was trying to create a space that could contain the practice. And then of course, as you kind of made more work and you grew as an artist, you want to start. And that was very difficult for me, learning how to take up space, because I feel like I've been taught not to take up space. You know, when you're sort of like working class, you're just like, do your thing, don't cause trouble. And so everything like, and it was really interesting because when I was doing the dance workshop, one of the things that I found very difficult doing was when I was asked to like just run and like stretch out my arm, I couldn't do it. I felt very odd. I didn't know where to put my hands. And the choreographer was like, how do you normally paint? And at that point I was, you know, just still sort of coming out of that period, so of like painting the flowers. So I said, oh, usually I do this. And he was like, yeah, that's your body gesture. And that's how that gesture encapsulated like my condition of being, is that I was doing this. And now people ask me to do this and I just couldn't do it. And so actually it was also a process for me to say, I can go bigger. So I think as an artist, it's such an important skill to know how to expand and when to contract. Because I think as an artist, you are being put in different situations and you are given different type of stage, and you need to know how to kind of navigate those different spaces. And maybe the last thing is like a lot of it is just chance. Like the NGS commission was so like like out of the blue. And as an artist, I would have never caught this kind of commission because it's not within my everyday routine to make something so big. And I had to work with like architects and like engineers, and you know, it was something I was just not, but then it was just there. And then that gave me the space to just also just find other ways of working. Yeah.
Maybe we can wrap up today's talk, right? Yeah, please give a round of applause.